Welcome in, everyone, to another deep dive with us. Today we're going to be looking at the Book of Ruth, a story that's touched so many people. It's really about overcoming loss and discovering loyalty, and ultimately it's a story about redemption, about faith and family and about how God is always there, even when times are hard. Have you ever thought about a decision you made that, seemed small at the time, but then looking back, it had a massive impact? That's what we see in the story of Ruth.
It's fascinating because the Book of Ruth is set in ancient Israelite culture, a totally different world than ours. But the feelings, the relationships, the spiritual themes, they just connect with us no matter what time period we're in.
It's true. So the story starts with a family in Bethlehem struggling because of this terrible famine.
Yeah.
Elimelech, his wife Naomi, and their two sons, they head off to Moab, hoping to find food, maybe a fresh start. But then tragedy hits. Elimelech and both of his sons die, leaving Naomi alone with her two daughters-in-law, Orpah and Ruth.
It's just devastating for Naomi. She's lost her husband and her sons, and on top of that, she has no idea what the future holds. Being a widow in a patriarchal society was incredibly difficult, and that's the moment everything changes.
Naomi's heartbroken. She feels like God has abandoned her, and she decides to return to Bethlehem. She tells her daughters-in-law to stay in Moab, thinking they'll have a better chance at rebuilding their lives there. Orpah chooses to stay with her own people, which makes sense. But Ruth, she's Moabite, and she makes a decision that changes everything. She makes an incredible promise to Naomi, vowing to go to Bethlehem with her.
Think about how big of a decision this was for Ruth. She's leaving her whole life behind, her home, her family, her culture, even her gods. Everything that's familiar to her is gone. She's heading into an unknown future, all because of her love and loyalty to her mother-in-law. It's so powerful that I think we should hear it straight from the book. In Ruth chapter 1, verses 16 and 17. Entreat me not to leave thee, or to return from following after thee. For whither thou goest, I will go, and where thou lodgest, I will lodge. Thy people shall be my people, and thy God my God. Where thou diest will I die, and there will I be buried. The Lord do so to me, and more also, if aught but death part thee and me.
It's incredible how powerful those words are, even after all these years. You can feel the depth of Ruth's commitment. And I was struck by the fact that Naomi's name changes. From meaning pleasant to bitter. She becomes Mara. What do you think that tells us about what she's going through emotionally and spiritually?
I think it's a powerful reflection of everything she's going through. The grief, the loss. It really feels like she's wrestling with the idea that God has abandoned her. But even in the midst of all that despair, Ruth's unwavering loyalty shines through, like a tiny seed of faith in the barren soil of her heart.
So they arrive in Bethlehem with nothing. It's the beginning of the barley harvest, and Ruth needs to find a way to provide for herself and Naomi. And this seemingly simple need leads to a life-changing encounter. It sets up a whole chain of events that transforms everything.
It really does feel like some kind of divine intervention, like fate guiding her steps. She ends up gleaning in the fields of Boaz. Now, Boaz is a wealthy landowner, and he also happens to be a relative of Naomi's deceased husband.
It makes you think about those things that seem like coincidence in our lives, right? Sometimes those random events turn out to be pivotal moments, almost like divine appointments. And we see that Boaz is immediately impressed by Ruth. He learns about her loyalty to Naomi and her willingness to work hard to support her. He treats her with kindness and respect, makes sure she has enough to eat, and is safe while she's working in the fields.
And what's interesting is his actions are rooted in this deeper cultural practice, the idea of the kinsman redeemer. Basically, in ancient Israel, this was a male relative who was obligated to protect the family line and the property of a relative who had passed away. It was kind of like, if someone in your family died and a close relative stepped in to inherit their property, but also to take care of their family.
Yeah, that's a really good way to put it. It makes it a lot easier to understand. So Boaz, as a kinsman to Naomi's husband, he could marry Ruth and buy back the land that belonged to Elimelech and continue the family line.
Exactly. And it's amazing how Naomi, even though she's grieving, she starts to feel hope again. She sees the potential in this situation, and she starts to guide Ruth, gives her advice and wisdom.
I have to admit, when I first read about the scene at the threshing floor, I was a little confused. But then I learned about what it meant back then. Naomi tells Ruth how to approach Boaz in a subtle way, to let him know she's available for marriage. Can you imagine that today? Someone wanting to get married, having to do something so bold in public? It's kind of what Ruth was doing.
It does seem strange to us, but in that culture, it was a respectful way for Ruth to appeal to Boaz, as the kinsman redeemer. And it's important to remember that Boaz doesn't take advantage of the situation at all. He's impressed by Ruth's courage and the way she honors tradition. He recognizes her goodness and promises to do what's right. But there's a problem.
Oh, yeah, I remember this part. It's like a plot twist.
Boaz explains that there's another kinsman who's actually closer in line to be the redeemer. He tells Ruth he'll talk to this other relative first because that's how things were done. It's all about respect and fairness. Can you imagine the suspense? Everything for Ruth and Naomi depended on what this other guy would do.
Oh, it must have been so hard for them waiting and wondering. So what happened? Did this other kinsman do the right thing?
Well, first thing in the morning, Boaz goes to the city gate. That was where people gathered, and he waits for the other kinsman to show up. When he gets there, Boaz wants to do things properly, so he gets 10 elders of the city to be witnesses. He tells the kinsman everything about how Naomi is selling her husband's land and that he has the first chance to redeem it.
He's being really open and honest, following all the rules. It's almost like some kind of legal process.
It is. And at first, the kinsman seems willing. He says, I'll redeem it. But then Boaz tells him that if he buys the land, he'll also need to marry Ruth and have children who will be considered descendants of Naomi's deceased husband. Suddenly, the kinsman changes his mind.
I guess marrying someone from Moab, a foreigner, and potentially complicating his inheritance wasn't worth it for him.
It makes you think about why people do things, right? It seems like he was more interested in the land itself than doing what a kinsman redeemer is supposed to do. But this is where Boaz's true character shines through. He doesn't even hesitate. He's ready to do what's right for both Naomi and Ruth.
So how does this all become official? Did they sign a contract or something?
Well, in a way, yes. To make the deal official, the kinsman takes off his sandal and gives it to Boaz. This was a custom in ancient Israel that meant he was giving up his property and rights.
Wow, such a small gesture, but so much meaning. And with that, Boaz becomes the redeemer, and he can marry Ruth. It's a victory for both of them and for Naomi, who sees her family's name and legacy being restored.
It's a powerful example of how God can take something that looks hopeless and bring redemption. But there's more to the story. The book goes on to describe the marriage of Boaz and Ruth and the birth of their son Obed. We see the community celebrating this new life, a symbol of hope and God's promise.
And remember how Naomi was called Mara, which meant bitter? Now the women of Bethlehem are saying, Blessed be the Lord, which hath not left thee this day without a kinsman, that his name may be famous in Israel. It's like they're acknowledging that God has been working behind the scenes all along to bring this about.
It's a beautiful reminder that even when we feel alone, God is with us. He's working even when we don't see it. But here's something really interesting. The story doesn't stop there. The book ends with a genealogy of Obed's descendants. And guess who's in that lineage?
Someone important. Could it be? King David.
You got it. Obed becomes the grandfather of King David, one of the greatest kings in Israel's history. And we all know that David is a key figure in the lineage of Jesus.
It's mind-blowing when you think about it. The seemingly ordinary woman, Ruth, playing such an important role in history. It makes you wonder who the unsung heroes are in our own time, right?
It's a good reminder that God's plan is often much bigger than we can see. Even those who feel like they don't belong can be used by God for his purpose. But before we finish up, I want to talk about the women in this story. We've talked about Boaz a lot, but what about Naomi and Ruth? How do they handle the societal expectations of their time? What can we learn from their strength, their resilience, and their amazing bond?
Yeah, you're right. They were both widows dealing with incredibly difficult circumstances in a patriarchal society. It would have been so easy for them to just give up, but they didn't.
It's incredible how, despite their losses and their lack of social standing, they're actively shaping their own destinies. Naomi, even in her grief, shows amazing resilience. She leaves Moab, where she was relatively comfortable, and goes back to Bethlehem, where she has to depend on the kindness of others. And she doesn't just sit around waiting for things to happen. She guides Ruth, gives her advice and wisdom.
She's like a mentor helping Ruth to navigate this new and challenging world. And Ruth, she's not just following along. She's strong and resourceful and incredibly loyal. Her decision to stay with Naomi, to embrace a new land and a new God, says so much about her character.
Exactly. And don't forget, she's the one who goes out and works in the fields. She works tirelessly to provide for herself and Naomi. She's not afraid of hard work, and she earns the respect of Boaz and the whole community by what she does.
It's interesting how their roles change throughout this story. At first, it seems like Naomi is the leader, the one making the decisions. But as Ruth finds her own strength, she becomes more of an equal partner. It's a beautiful example of how they support and empower each other.
Absolutely. And in the end, it's their combined strength, their unwavering faith, and their love for each other that leads them to redemption. Naomi, who felt abandoned by God, sees her family line restored. Ruth, a foreigner with an uncertain future, finds a loving husband and a place where she belongs.
And through it all, we see God working, orchestrating all these events to bring about an incredible outcome. The Book of Ruth reminds us that even when we're going through tough times, there's always hope. It shows us that kindness and loyalty can have a ripple effect that impacts not just us, but generations to come.
It's a message that never gets old. And I think it asks us an important question. How can we be a source of redemption in our own lives and the lives of others? How can we show the same loyalty, kindness, and faith that we see in Ruth and Naomi?
That's a question we should all think about. And
Yeah.
just maybe when we think about the Book of Ruth, we'll be inspired to be a little more compassionate, a little braver, and have a little more faith in the God who works everything out for good.
Beautifully said. I hope everyone listening will take the time to read the Book of Ruth for themselves. It's a short book, but full of wisdom and beauty that continues to speak to us today.
So there you have it, a deep dive into the Book of Ruth, a story about love, life, and redemption, reminding us that even in the most unexpected places, God is working, weaving together a tapestry of hope and grace. Thanks for joining us on this journey. Until next time, keep searching, keep asking questions, and keep diving deep.